Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be delving deeper into Romans chapter 11, focusing on verses 13 through 24. If you haven't already taken the chance to do so, I would like you to take a pause and read all of chapter 11 of Romans so that you can kind of see this in context. Remember, we're going to be zooming in on 13 through 24, but the couple of verses right before that are going to be kind of the springboard. So go ahead and take a pause and do that. Thanks, and welcome back. So, if we looked at how what Paul's grappling with in Romans 11 is he's trying to figure out what Israel's this what he's seeing as Israel's rejection of Jesus, what that means with regard to promises. And the whole thing is going to be banked upon the idea that God's a God who keeps his promises. If God doesn't keep his promises to Israel's, our confidence and promises for Christianity are at stake. So the stakes are really high. If you go back to Romans chapter 10, you have the end passage where it's like neither height nor depth nor anything can separate us from the love of God. But he sees this rejection of people who he thinks had the love of God, the Jewish people. And so he's grappling with what that means. And so he's dealing with a mystery that he sees throughout Scripture. It's like one of those things that on the front end of Scripture, you wouldn't see this coming, but in Paul's day, once he sees it, it kind of makes sense of what's there in the past. So, and what he sees is starting in verse 11. So I asked, did they stumble in order that they may fall? By no means. He's talking about the Israelites of his time uh, who did not accept Jesus as Messiah. Rather, through their trespass, rejection of Jesus, salvation has come to the Gentiles, that it's springboarded to the nations and fulfilling this idea that God's going to be God, Abraham is going to be a blessing to all the nations. So as to make them jealous, to make Israel jealous. So he's saying that God's people will come back around, hopefully, through seeing a relationship that Gentile Christians has. He's hoping actually to maybe be a part of this. Remember, the context of Romans as a whole, and you can see this at the very end of Romans, which will be a little bit delayed making videos for those. It's kind of already been covered in the background. The very end of Romans is setting up that he is kind of in the middle of this offering collection you see alluded to, in particularly Second Corinthians, where he gives very detailed instructions on how it works, where he's collecting money and people to bring back to Jerusalem in a time of famine, but also to show that he has remembered the poor, the very thing he desired to do, as he had been instructed. The poor, maybe being the poor mother church of Jerusalem. He's offering these Israelites as sort of Gentiles as a fulfillment of everything, and it looks a lot like the third ending part of Isaiah, where the nations come and deliver gifts. So uh, so he's looking at maybe this will be the spark. If not that, maybe his next big mission, which is going to be the Western Mediterranean, which is the other purpose of this book of Romans, is for him to come and get Rome support to the Roman Church's support to go towards Spain and the Western Mediterranean. He's hoping maybe that'll do it. He said he's not going to quit. He has the expectation that he probably isn't going to live forever, but he's going to do what he can to see this happen. So he says that their trespass meant riches for the world. He has this sort of apocalyptic expectation, a revealing expectation, that maybe future riches for the Gentiles came from the trespass of the Jews. How much more will the Jews' full inclusion? Whenever God's people do realize Messiah is Messiah, he's wondering maybe that'll be what we're waiting on. And that kind of sets up the passage that we're going to be delving into. So it says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. So he's saying, maybe I'm getting out of hand, I think would be a way to read this. Is like, okay, I know this is my job, and he's passionate about his job, which is something that any ministry should have. You should have a passion. It's like that on the one hand, you're humble enough to know the world doesn't depend on you. On the other hand, you offer to God as if it did. And so he's kind of doing that in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some. So his ministry is against the Gentiles, but he's like, I want to minister to Jews too. Maybe this is my way to do it. For if the rejection meant the reconciliation to the world, like he's saying, like the other nations are now coming to know the God that they had rejected, and we see that in Romans 1, where the Gentile nations had worshiped idols instead of God. Now they're coming to worship actual God. What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So he sees resurrection there. So he's saying if the dough is holy, the rejection, the initial thing ends up being holy. The first, if the dough offers first fruits is holy, then so is the whole lump. Or if the root is holy, so are the branches. So if the cause of this is holy, the rest of it, it should be a good tree. Like you'll know a tree by its fruits. The whole tree, start to finish, be good. This cause and effect relationship that he's seeing. If the rejection led to a good thing, the rest of it will lead to more good things. He's saying he's left in the first part of 11. He has like a worst case scenario for the Jewish inclusion and recognizing the Messiah. And here he's kind of getting kind of what for him might be the best case. Like right now this could happen, and we don't know. It'll be somewhere in that range. Which 2,000 years later, we know a few more things, but we don't know much more things that God's plan on that. So, and how he's going to talk about here is now an analogy of an olive tree. Uh, this isn't necessarily the best horticulture, but it's going to be the analogy is that God has tended this tree forever, an olive tree. There's a very similar analogy early in Isaiah, I want to say chapter 4. In that case, is a vineyard where Israel is God's vineyard that he's taking care of and taking care of and taking care of. But then it got rejected. It turned out not to bear good fruit. And you see that analogy throughout the Bible, these trees and vines, which the Bible's language actually doesn't really distinguish between vines and trees all that much. So they're kind of all for them one plant in a way it isn't in English. But looking back into that, he sees this tended, well cultivated thing, this tree, something that has the best fruit's been selected year, century after century after century until they're the best tree, and it's been pruned and it's been grafted, and better roots have been grafted with better olive taste and all that, and more resistance, and you've had this cultivated relationship of like the best olive tree. And the analogy he's having of that is that's the Old Testament. His relationship, God's relationship to his people through the whole Old Testament, is this pruning of this tree that he sees as Israel. And we're going to kind of pick up where this left off. Now, if some of the branches were broken off, talking about of the olive tree, and talking about Jews and Paul's day rejecting Jesus, and you, although a wild olive shoot, basically a thing that doesn't belong. So like what I don't know if they call this ever in the country, but like trees that are volunteers, or you look around and you see just another tree coming up without having been planted. It's just out there untended. There's this like other trees that showed up, like the Gentiles in Paul's churches, where you have maybe just some dude on the street that just kind of wanders in, not as a result of 2,000 years of pruning like in the Old Testament, but just kind of wandering in. But that when the initial tree had rejected Christ, some of these had gotten grafted into the tree instead. So he's talking about the Gentile Christians. If some of you were grafted in with others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, talking about the whole passive Israel, do not be arrogant towards the branches. So one problem that might be happening when we get to the end chapters of Romans, that may be the whole point of this whole thing actually, might be that Gentile Christians are kind of looking down on Jewish Christians in Rome for some reason. And we'll kind of try to suss that out when we get to, it'll probably be the last few videos in Romans 14. So it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. It was there before you got there. You're a newcomer. It wasn't you. It's been there the whole time. There's no need to be arrogant. If most Jews had rejected, you're still in there. Those branches aren't home there in a way the Gentile branches were not. Uh, then you will say branches were broken off so that might be grafted in. That is true. So he's saying the rejection allowed them to come in God's plan. That's true, but they were broken off because of their unbelief. So again, it comes down to belief over all things. But you stand fast through faith. So make sure you maintain your faith. So do not become proud, but fear. And I don't know if it means shaking your boots, but it's also like you don't take it for granted that you're there by birth or by works or that God owes you anything. You only have it there by faith. If those branches are broken off by not having belief and faith and trust that Messiah has come, that God has taken care of it, that God has delivered, that the news is good right now, then it says these branches can't. And we'll kind of look at the Gentile branches that are new, definitely can get broken off. Do not be proud, but fear, for if God cannot spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note the kindness and severity of God, severity of those who have fallen, and God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. In other words, otherwise you too will be cut off. It says, don't take for granted this. So, what do we do with this? With the neither height nor death nor angels or demons can separate you from the love of God that we see in Romans 10, the sort of verses that lead Baptists and Calvinists to conclusions like once saved, always saved. This would be kind of one of the passages that you throw back in the face of that. At minimum, it means, though, you don't inherit the faith of your parents. If Jews can inherit the faith of their parents, you definitely can't. So he's doing that. That's at least a conclusion, and I think he might be saying something more boldly here, but he's at least saying that. So this is one of those things. It's like there's no coasting into heaven on this, or coasting into being in the kingdom of God right now. It says, otherwise you may be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, so it doesn't take much for it to be grafted back in, shall be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. These branches have been cut off. If God cut them off, he can put a wild one in. He can definitely put a cultivated branch back in. So if the Jews come to believe, they pop right into the church just fine. There's no reason to be proud of not having been a Jew. There's no basis for anti-Semitism, for example, here. And so that is actually not the best horticulture, but it's like meant to be his sort of high logic for this. Uh, for if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? So the natural branches, the potential to always come home is sort of there, is what he's holding at. And this is what he's hoping against hope as he rolls into the conclusion of his main argument. And so we'll finish it right there, and thanks for your attention.